This is Magna Carta. This is the foundation of liberty, the source of our system of constitutional government, of the rule of law, of everything that is great and good in Western liberal democracy. Unless, of course, you're an 11 or 12-year-old on a Thursday afternoon on a dreary history lesson caught somewhere between maths and geography, in which case Magna Carta is quite literally scribble on a page. And worse than that, it's Latin scribble on a page. In fact, it's bad Latin scribbled on a page, abbreviated, illegible, unintelligible, and utterly meaningless. And yet, the requirements of the new national curriculum, of the new GCSE specifications and A-level specifications, is that children as young as 11 or 12 should engage with this document and be inspired by it in order to share those great British values. So there's the challenge. How do you get children as young as 11 or 12 to engage with one of the most challenging of documents in our Constitution? And I think we make life difficult for ourselves because of the story that we tell about Magna Carta. So it begins as something between a meeting, a rebellion and a battle in a field in Surrey back in 1215. And then it seems to just vanish from history. Within 8 weeks, the charter has been abrogated, the Pope has annulled it, and it seems to vanish. Which must cause many 11 and 12-year-olds to say, so why are we still learning about it today? Well, that's because somehow magically it comes back in the 17th century in the English Civil War. It then gets appropriated by the Americans for their revolution and is finally taken up as an idea by a bunch of Mancunian factory workers in the 19th century. And it's really only in the 20th century that Magna Carta comes of age in the dark ages of the Blitz and comes back to inspire us all. So given that rather confusing story, the challenge is how do we get students to engage with this and really be inspired by this document as well as to understand it. So what we wanted to do was to inspire children not just with Magna Carta but with medieval history on a wider scale. We had already begun a project 3 years ago to look at our collection and see how we could engage young students with our medieval documents. We have one of the largest collections of medieval documents in the world, and yet we had very poor provision for school students. We had only one workshop relating to Domesday Book and only a handful of resources on our website. So we were already looking at how we could take that collection and create something for students to use in the classroom. I then got one of those fortuitous phone calls from Parliament, from the head of public engagement there, to say, what are you doing for Magna Carta next year? And we didn't actually have any plans directly to do something specifically on Magna Carta. But being enticed with a lump of cash from Parliament, which, let's be honest, is a rarity, we decided that we would match their offer and that we would come up with a resource that would allow 11 to 18-year-olds to engage with this document. So we wanted to get across the beauty of the medieval manuscript because, let's be honest, medieval manuscripts can be beautiful, and we have a fine collection here. We have Matthew Parris's Historia Anglorum. We have the French Chronicle of London. And we really wanted to get students to be inspired by these beautiful manuscripts. But the only problem is that none of these are in the National Archives collection. Our medieval documents look slightly less enticing. So they look things like this pipe roll from 1214. This is the arrangement for King John with Geoffrey de Mandeville, where King John basically sells his ex-wife to Geoffrey of Mandeville Isabella, Countess of Gloucester, who was the wealthiest woman in England at the time. And Geoffrey de Mandeville has to pay 20,000 marks for the pleasure of marrying King John's ex-wife. We have really, truly inspiring documents like tax collection instructions from 1225. This is assessing and collecting movable goods to the value of 1/15, issued by Henry III. We have the summons to Parliament from Simon de Montfort in 1265. And my particular favourite is this filthy-looking piece of toilet roll, which lists the confiscation of lands from rebel barons by King John in 1214. So, given that we don't have these beautiful illuminated manuscripts, it's easy to see why something like that may be popular with teachers and how they would particularly focus on the imagery of those manuscripts. But of course, there's problems with those manuscripts as well. We wanted students to basically do real history, to engage with primary source material, to investigate the period of Magna Carta throughout the 13th century, and answer some key historical questions. The problem with chronicles is that they're not primary sources. These are authored material, often from people who are writing about a previous generation, often from people who have a very limited access to information about that which they're writing. And certainly, they don't have access to the kind of material that we can now give our students access to. Matthew Parris couldn't see many of the documents that we were able to provide to our students when he was writing his History of England. He was stuck in a monastery in St Albans. When he was writing his revised version in the 1250s, his main source of information was Henry III himself. Quite literally, Henry would go and sit with Matthew Parris and say, no, it wasn't like that, it was like this. So the idea that we could actually give students access to information that the chroniclers of the time didn't have access to was quite an enticing idea. But how do you get that across to teachers and to students so that they'll engage with it? So we created this web resource. This is within our main education section of the Magna Carta website. And it's a resource that's designed to be used independently by students, not as a classroom resource, but as a kind of supplementary to classroom activities. We have classroom activities for teachers to use in the classroom, but we wanted something where students would investigate Magna Carta independently. And so to do that, we had to begin by framing an inquiry. We have a particular approach to the teaching of history at the National Archives, which begins with the archival collection and then encourages students to ask questions about that collection and use the collection to answer those questions. So we begin by framing the inquiry with this opening video, which asks, why does Magna Carta keep coming back?
This is Magna Carta. And this. And this. And this. The first thing you've noticed is that there are 4 versions, and not just the famous one from 1215 that most people know about. Why is this? It's because Magna Carta was an attempt to solve the key questions of the 13th century and beyond. The questions were, is the king above the law, or is he bound by the law? Who decides whether the king has broken the law? Who makes the law anyway? Have no doubt about how seriously people took these questions. Kings and barons were prepared to go to war over them. So who were these barons who sometimes dared to challenge the king?
Go and find that out for yourselves by looking at the resource yourself later on. So what we did was we took the 1215 issue of Magna Carta, and we wanted to place that at the kind of centre of a much broader period of history. We wanted to show that 1215 hadn't suddenly come out of nowhere, so what we actually did was to roll right back to 1066 and provide an opportunity for students to set 1215 within that context. But we also, because in our collection we don't have a 1215 copy of Magna Carta, we have a 1225 issued by Henry III, and we have the definitive 1297 version issued by Edward I. We wanted to show that actually Magna Carta was an evolving document that is reissued time and time again. So we actually look specifically at Magna Carta at four periods of 1215, issued by King John, 1225, issued by his son Henry III, 1265, issued by Simon de Montfort, and then 1297, issued by Edward I. And look at why does it continue to be issued, and why and how does it change over time? And what are the implications for an institution like Parliament, for example, with this continual reissuing of Magna Carta? So for each chapter, there are 6 chapters in total throughout the resource. With each chapter, there is a key inquiry question. Chapter 2 is, why does King John face rebellion? We have a huge cast of characters. We decided that the only way that we could really engage students with this was by creating characters from the time and bringing them back to life. So across the screen here we have King John at the top, we have young Matthew Parris. We're about to embark on a century of discovery, so consequently Matthew Parris has to age. So in 1215 he's just a 15-year-old, he was born in 1200, so he's the same age as the century. He's a 15-year-old just entering as a novice at St Albans when he first engages students, which is quite a nice hook really, because he's the same age as many of the students that are going to be using this resource. But of course, over time he ages, so at the bottom there we have Matthew Parris in 1258. This was going to be another challenge for us because in kind of true Hollywood style, our key character dies off mid-production. So we discussed various ways that we could keep the voice of Matthew Parris running after he dies in 1259, particularly as he inconveniently dies 6 years before the reissue by Simon de Montfort. And then he's presumably mouldering in the grave by the time we get to 1297. So that was going to be a challenge. And we considered all sorts of devices in order to do that. I won't spoil it for you. Again, I'll let you go and find out how we keep the voice of Matthew Parris running when you go and look at the resource for yourselves. But we also wanted to bring in other characters, lesser well-known characters. Matthew Bracton at the top, who is a constitutional lawyer and wrote extensively about the impact of Magna Carta. Often in very confused and conflicting terms, and we wanted to get that across to students, that people at the time really didn't understand Magna Carta perfectly themselves. They were kind of working through this. And Bracton allows us to get that across really well. We have the voice of various barons, Simon de Montfort, and the church is represented there by Stephen Langton. And we had a fantastic opportunity because Henry III manages to get himself locked up in the middle of the story. We had a great opportunity to bring his wife Eleanor in. So we have Queen Eleanor there with an outrageous French accent as well. So the point of the characters is to set context and inquiry. So this is young Matthew Parris, kind of welcoming us in and setting us our first inquiry.
Welcome back, my dear friend. I am glad you have returned to help me. When we last spoke, I was telling you that the barons had little love for King John. Since then, the situation has gone from bad to worse, and England is in the grip of open warfare between the barons and the king. I need your help again. I have drafted a rough copy of my Chronicle which contains some of the main events. but I'm finding it hard to make up my mind about some of the key questions. Is King John simply trying to govern England more effectively? Or is he a despicable tyrant intent on crushing any who oppose him? Are the barons men of principle? Or are they simply trying to look after their own interests and avoid paying tax? And what role is the church playing in these troubled times? Is it supporting the king or the barons? And why? I have sifted through mountains of documents and I've selected a number which I think may help us to decide how we have ended up in this difficult position. I have also managed to persuade some of the key figures in this drama to speak to you, including Robert Fitzwalter, who appears to be a leader of the rebels, Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, the leader of the church in England, and even King John himself. They're all eager to help us set the record straight on this great matter, so don't forget to make any notes that might be useful, and we can add these to the Chronicle. To help you on your travels around the country, I have drawn you this fine map so you can locate the documents and the important people that you must speak with. I hope you find it of use.
So we use Matthew Parris as a guide for students. He sets the inquiries, he introduces them to characters, he uses his wonderful maps. We update his map throughout the period, so we begin with that rather brief map of England, which he had drawn in 1225, but he does this much better map later in the century, which we make use of. And we wanted, again, to give a sense of period. The interviews with characters are there to engage students and really drive them to go and look at particular documents. So this is King John.
These unruly barons are complaining that I have made them pay more taxes and have acted unfairly by locking them up or confiscating their land if they objected. But these are fair taxes to help England out of its present problems.
It then drives them to look at particular documents from the collection. We have transcripts for those documents.
William, son of William, son of Alan, owes 10,000 marks for holding the land which belonged to the aforementioned William, his father, next to the land which the same William gave his daughter Petronilla.
And as a guide to help students understand that, we have Matthew Parris explaining why he selected those particular documents.
Here we see an enormous sum being charged to William FitzAlan to take possession of his lands. John's father, Henry II, promised to set a reasonable rate, and the customary amount for a small or medium-sized estate was about £100.
So now we've got some context. We understand that £10,000 to inherit your estate is a huge amount of money, and we can start to see why certain barons were getting fed up with John. What we want them to do is to write a history. Matthew Parris is very good at writing a chronicle, which is basically a bash through the events, but he doesn't give any explanation about why these things are happening. And so the role of the student is to help Matthew Parris with that chronicle and explain why these events are taking place. So the chronicle that they create is actually a history rather than just a straightforward chronicle. When we were testing this with students at Magna Carta School, the first thing they said are, where are the badges? What do we get for doing this? Where's the motivation for us to do that? So we've created a series of badges, which as you progress through the site, you collect more and more pieces. There are 5 badges in total: Explorator, which is explorer; Inquisitor, researcher; Interrogator, for interviewing people. Every time you complete a chapter of the Chronicle, you get a Chronicator badge, and if you do all of this, you become Magister Chronicator. So it all sounds very Harry Potter-ish, which is quite intentional, and it certainly seemed to really engage students with them. So I would implore you and recommend that you go and have a look at the website. So far we have had over 30,000 visits to the site. Average duration of visits is 12.5 minutes. Which, given the usual bounce rate, that's pretty good, and is about 50% longer engagement than any other resource that we created in the past. Thank you. much.